The sixth grade math class buzzed with the usual morning energy as students settled into their seats, the autumn sunlight streaming through the classroom windows. At the front of the room, Mrs. Reynolds wrote a complex algebra problem on the whiteboard, her chalk making sharp tapping sounds in the quiet room. In the third row, a bright young boy with warm brown eyes sat up straight, his hand reaching confidently toward the ceiling. He had spent extra time studying this chapter last night, and the answer practically leaped off the board at him. His hand remained steady, waiting to be called on, while other students around him whispered and shuffled through their notebooks. "Can anyone solve this equation?" Mrs. Reynolds asked, turning to face the class. Her eyes swept across the room, deliberately skipping over the eager student whose hand had been raised first. Anyone at all? A few more hands slowly went up. The boy's arm was starting to tire, but he kept it raised, shifting slightly to maintain his position. He had learned from his parents that persistence and patience were important values. "How about you, Michael?" Mrs. Reynolds called on a student who had just raised his hand. The boy's arm remained in the air, now slightly trembling from being held up so long. I'm not sure," Michael admitted, lowering his hand. "Lisa." Mrs. Reynolds moved on to another student. "I think it's 15. Lisa guessed incorrectly. The boy couldn't contain himself any longer. "The answer is 12, he said clearly, his voice carrying across the classroom. "If you isolate the variable and—" "I don't remember calling on you." Mrs. Reynolds cut him off sharply, her voice taking on an edge that she never seemed to use with other students. "We raise our hands in this classroom and wait to be called on. That's basic classroom etiquette." The other students fell silent, the atmosphere growing thick with tension. A few of them exchanged uncomfortable glances, knowing full well that their classmate had been raising his hand the entire time. "But I did raise my hand," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the hurt building in his chest. "I raised it first." "Are you talking back to me?" Mrs. Reynolds asked, her eyebrows arching high. "Perhaps you need to visit the principal's office to review proper classroom behavior." The boy sat there, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked down at his notebook where he had neatly written out the problem's solution, each step carefully shown, just as his father had taught him. His dad always said that education was the key to success, that if you worked hard and showed respect, doors would open. But right now, it felt like doors were slamming shut in his face. A few seats away, his friend was quietly recording the interaction on her phone under her desk, having noticed a pattern forming over the past few weeks. She had seen how Mrs. Reynolds treated her friend differently, how she would praise other students for the same answers she dismissed from him, how she seemed to find fault with everything he did. The bell rang, signaling the end of class. As students gathered their books, the boy sat there for a moment longer, taking slow breaths like his mother had taught him. He carefully packed his bag, his movements deliberate and controlled, even as his hands shook slightly. This wasn't the first time Mrs. Reynolds had singled him out, but it was the first time he decided he would no longer stay silent. That evening, he would finally tell his father, a successful attorney who had built his career fighting for justice, about what had been happening in Mrs. Reynolds' class. Little did the teacher know that her actions were about to catch up with her, and the quiet student she had been unfairly targeting had a powerful advocate in his corner. As weeks passed by in Mrs. Reynolds' math class, things only got worse. The young boy who once loved coming to school now spent his mornings dragging his feet, his backpack feeling heavier with each passing day. It wasn't just about one bad day anymore. It had turned into something that made his stomach twist every time he walked through the classroom door. Last Thursday, when they got their math tests back, something didn't feel right. The boy had checked his answers 3 times before turning in his paper, just like his mom always told him to do. He knew he'd gotten most of them right. Math had always been his best subject. But when Mrs. Reynolds dropped his test on his desk, a big red C stared back at him. "I expected better," she had said loudly enough for everyone to hear, shaking her head. though I suppose we all have different capabilities. The boy waited until lunch break to look over his test carefully. His heart sank as he found question after question marked wrong for the smallest things. Decimal points that were supposedly unclear, minus signs she claimed were too short, and work that she said wasn't shown properly, even though he'd written out every step. That same day, he noticed his classmate had made similar calculations with much messier handwriting, yet received an A. When he politely raised his hand to ask about the grading, Mrs. Reynolds had cut him off. "If you're going to question my teaching methods," she'd snapped, "perhaps your parents should come in for a conference." During group projects, he found himself sitting alone more often. Not because his classmates didn't want to work with him, they did, but because Mrs. Reynolds would always step in and reassign groups, claiming she was promoting diversity in learning styles. Somehow, he always ended up working by himself. His friend from the seat next to him tried to help. She had started keeping a small notebook where she wrote down everything she noticed. Today, Mrs. R gave him detention for being too loud while reading, one entry said. He was whispering, just like everyone else. Another note read, "She praised Timothy for using excellent vocabulary, but told him his words were showing off." The boy's grades kept dropping, not because he didn't know the answers, but because he'd started second-guessing everything he wrote. His hand would shake slightly when solving problems he used to breeze through. Each time he raised his hand, Mrs. Reynolds would make a show of sighing heavily before calling on him, as if his very presence was exhausting. One particularly tough day, while explaining a complex problem to the class, Mrs. Reynolds stopped mid-sentence when she saw him nodding along in understanding. "Oh, you think you already know this?" she asked with a sharp edge to her voice. "Why don't you come up and teach the class then?" He had actually known the answer, but as he stood there at the front of the room, her stern glare made his mind go blank. After a few uncomfortable moments of silence, she dismissed him back to his seat with a satisfied smirk. "That's what I thought," she had said. "Sometimes it's better to stay quiet when you're not sure about things." But he had been sure. He'd been sure about a lot of things, like how unfair this all was, how different she treated him compared to others, and how her actions were slowly crushing his love for learning. That night, as he sat at his desk trying to do homework, tears of frustration rolled down his cheeks. His little sister noticed and gave him a big hug, asking why he looked so sad all the time now. That was the moment something clicked inside him. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for every kid who might end up in Mrs. Reynolds' class in the future. With newfound determination, he pulled out his phone and began recording a message to his dad, starting with the words, "I need to tell you something important about what's been happening at school." Little did Mrs. Reynolds know, her carefully constructed facade of authority was about to crack, as one brave student finally decided to speak up and let the truth be heard. The morning of the class presentations felt different. The boy had spent hours preparing, researching, and practicing his speech about famous mathematicians throughout history. His mom had helped him create beautiful visual aids, and his little sister had sat through 3 practice runs, giving him a thumbs up each time. As he walked into class clutching his note cards, he noticed Mrs. Reynolds watching him with that familiar look, the one that made his confidence shrink. But today, he held his head high. This presentation was his chance to show everyone what he could do. Next up, Mrs. Reynolds announced, checking her list with exaggerated attention, "Let's see what kind of presentation you've prepared for us." The boy stood up, his heart beating fast but steady. He barely opened his mouth when Mrs. Reynolds cut in. "Speak up, please. We can't hear you mumbling back there." Taking a deep breath, he started again, this time louder. "Today, I'll be talking about Katherine Johnson, the mathematician who helped NASA." "Excuse me," Mrs. Reynolds interrupted again, her voice dripping with suspicion. "Did you write this yourself? These seem like awfully big words for someone your age." The class fell silent. Everyone knew he was one of the best students in English class. The boy felt his ears getting hot, but he stayed calm. Yes, Mrs. Reynolds. I researched everything myself. I can show you my notes. Continue, she waved her hand dismissively, but keep it simple. We wouldn't want to confuse anyone with words you might not fully understand. His classmates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The girl who sat near the window had her phone propped against her pencil case, its camera lens catching everything. Another student was pretending to take notes, but was actually writing down what Mrs. Reynolds was saying. The boy pressed on, talking about Katherine Johnson's calculations for space missions. His voice grew stronger as he shared facts he'd memorized, his passion for the subject shining through. Just as he was describing Johnson's role in the moon landing, Mrs. Reynolds stood up. That's enough, she declared. I think we've all heard plenty about how much you think you know. Why don't you tell us where you really got this information? No one expects you to come up with this level of work on your own. The boy's hands trembled slightly, but he reached into his folder. I have all my research right here, he said quietly but firmly. I can show you the books I used from the library and my note cards. Are you talking back to me again? Mrs. Reynolds' voice rose starkly. I've had enough of your attitude. Go to the principal's office. Now. The boy looked around the room, seeing the shocked faces of his classmates. Some looked down at their desks, others watched with wide eyes. His friend who had been recording everything gave him a small nod. They both knew this moment was important. As he gathered his things, he didn't rush. He carefully collected his note cards, his poster board, and his folder full of research. Each movement was deliberate, each second captured on his friend's phone. He could feel Mrs. Reynolds growing more impatient, but he didn't hurry. Walking to the door, he stopped and turned around. In a voice that surprised even himself with its clarity, he said, I did do all this work myself, Mrs. Reynolds, and I can prove it. The silence in the classroom was deafening. Mrs. Reynolds' face turned a shade of red he'd never seen before. Out, she nearly shouted. To the principal's office, right now. As he walked down the empty hallway, his footsteps echoing against the lockers, he felt something strange. Not fear, not anger, but a sense of relief. He pulled out his phone and texted his dad, Can you come to school? It's time. What Mrs. Reynolds didn't know was that her worst nightmare was about to walk through the school doors. A parent who wouldn't just listen to her excuses, but one who had spent his entire career fighting against people just like her. The quiet, brilliant student she had tried so hard to break was about to teach her the most important lesson of all. Justice doesn't always wear a cape. Sometimes it carries a briefcase and calls itself Dad. That evening, the kitchen was quiet except for the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the occasional clink of dishes being put away. The boy sat at the dining table, pushing his mom's famous spaghetti around his plate without eating. His father, still in his suit from work, noticed the unusual behavior of his normally chatty son. You've barely touched your food, his dad said softly, pulling up a chair beside him. What's on your mind, son? The boy looked up at his father, whose kind eyes had always made him feel safe. Those same eyes had watched him take his first steps, had beamed with pride at every school achievement, and now waited patiently for him to find his voice. Dad, he started, his voice barely above a whisper. Remember when you told me that standing up for what's right is important, even when it's scary? His father nodded, putting down his fork. The boy's little sister, sensing the serious conversation, quietly slipped away from the table, giving her brother a gentle pat on the shoulder as she left. I need to show you something, the boy continued, pulling out his phone with slightly shaking hands. I've been keeping track, just like you taught me. Document everything, you always say. He opened his photo gallery and started showing his father the evidence he'd collected over the past few months. Pictures of his assignments with unfair grades. Screenshots of similar work from other students who received better marks. Then he played the recordings, his friend's phone footage from that day's presentation, and other incidents they'd captured. His father's expression remained calm. but the boy could see the muscle in his jaw tightening as he watched video after video. The unfair interruptions, the dismissive tone, the constant questioning of his abilities, it was all there. And here, the boy said, pulling out his notebook, I'd wrote down the dates and times of everything I could remember. When she wouldn't call on me, when she made me sit alone, when she... His voice cracked slightly. When she made me feel like I wasn't smart enough to be in her class. His mother, who had been listening from the kitchen, came and wrapped her arms around him. Why didn't you tell us sooner, sweetheart? The boy wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I thought maybe I was imagining it. Or maybe if I just worked harder. He pulled out the folder from his backpack, the one with his presentation research. Today, I tried to show her I did all the work myself, but she wouldn't even look at it. His father picked up the folder, carefully examining the detailed notes, the library checkout slips, the handwritten drafts. Each page was a testament to his son's dedication and intelligence. Some of my friends helped too, the boy added, showing more recordings from different angles of the classroom. They saw what was happening. They wanted to help. His father set down the phone and took both of his son's hands in his. I want you to know something very important, he said, his voice firm but gentle. What's happening to you isn't right, and it isn't your fault. You've shown incredible strength by gathering all this evidence, and even more strength by speaking up. The boy looked up, seeing the fierce determination in his father's eyes, the same look he got when preparing for an important case. You remember the Martin Luther King Jr. quote in my office? His father asked. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Sometimes, though, it needs a little help with the bending. Tomorrow, we're going to make sure justice happens. For the first time in weeks, the boy felt the heavy weight lifting from his shoulders. As his mom brought him a warm cookie and his sister returned with one of his favorite comic books, he realized he wasn't alone in this fight anymore. His father made a few phone calls that evening, speaking in his serious lawyer voice. The boy couldn't hear everything, but he caught phrases like documented evidence and pattern of behavior and immediate action required. As he got ready for bed that night, the boy heard his father say to his mother, Tomorrow, Mrs. Reynolds is going to learn that she picked the wrong student to discriminate against. Our son isn't just any student. He's a warrior for justice, just like his old man. Over the next few days, the boy's father worked like a detective putting together pieces of a puzzle. His home office became command central, with papers spread across his desk and sticky notes covering his computer screen. Each evening, more parents would stop by, their faces serious as they shared their own children's stories. My daughter used to love math, one mother said, sitting on the office couch with her hands wrapped around a coffee mug. Now she begs to stay homesick. I thought she was just going through a phase, but after hearing your son's story. The boy sat quietly in the corner, doing his homework but listening to every word. His father nodded, taking careful notes as another parent described how Mrs. Reynolds had treated their child differently too. She told my son he should focus on sports instead of advanced math. A father shared, his voice tight with anger. Said some students were better suited for different activities. My boy's been solving complex math problems since he was 5. As more families came forward, a clear pattern emerged. The boy's father created a timeline on the wall, using different colored sticky notes to track incidents. Red for direct discrimination, blue for unfair grading, yellow for dismissive comments. The wall began to look like a rainbow, but not the happy kind. One evening, while his father was on the phone with another parent, the boy's friend from class stopped by with her parents. She brought her phone, loaded with weeks of secret recordings. I knew something was wrong, she explained, showing them a video of Mrs. Reynolds praising one student's work while criticizing identical answers from others. That's why I started recording. My mom always says if you see something wrong, you should do something about it. The boy's father discovered something else that made his eyebrows shoot up. This wasn't Mrs. Reynolds' first teaching job. She had moved between 3 different schools in the past 5 years, each time leaving suddenly in the middle of the year. "Look at this," he said to the boy's mother one night, pointing to his computer screen. Every time parents started complaining, she would transfer to a new school. The complaints were buried, and she just started over somewhere else. The boy's little sister, who had been coloring nearby, looked up. "That's like when I spill juice and try to hide it by moving my cup to a different spot," she said wisely. "But Mom always finds out anyway." Everyone chuckled, but her simple observation hit home. Mrs. Reynolds had been running from her actions instead of facing them, and now there would be nowhere left to hide. The evidence kept mounting. Former students from other schools began reaching out after hearing about the investigation through their parents. Each story was different, but they all shared the same theme: unfair treatment, damaged confidence, and a teacher who seemed to enjoy making certain students feel small. One night, as the boy helped his father organize the growing pile of evidence, he found an old photograph from his first day of school. In it, he was beaming at the camera, excited about learning. Looking at his reflection in the computer screen, he realized that spark had dimmed over the past few months, but it wasn't gone. If anything, it was changing into something stronger. "Dad," he said, holding up the photo, "do you think other kids stopped loving school because of teachers like Mrs. Reynolds?" His father paused from his typing, turning to face his son. "Probably," he said honestly. "But that's exactly why what we're doing is so important. Sometimes it takes one person standing up to make change happen for everyone." The boy nodded, understanding now why his father worked so late on cases, why he always said that justice was worth fighting for. Looking at the wall of evidence, he felt proud. Not just of himself, but of everyone who had been brave enough to come forward and tell their stories. As his father prepared for the upcoming meeting with the school board, he pulled his son aside. "Remember," he said, straightening the boy's collar, "tomorrow isn't just about proving Mrs. Reynolds wrong. It's about making sure every student after you gets the respect they deserve." The boy smiled, feeling stronger than he had in months. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, the truth would finally come out. The principal's office felt smaller than usual that morning. Sunlight streamed through the Venetian blinds, casting striped shadows across the polished conference table. The boy sat between his parents, his father's leather briefcase placed carefully on the table in front of them. Mrs. Reynolds walked in with her usual confident stride, barely glancing at the family as she took her seat. The principal sat at the head of the table, looking uncomfortable as he shuffled some papers. The atmosphere was thick with tension, like the air before a storm. "Thank you all for coming," the principal began, but the boy's father politely raised his hand. "Before we start," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I'd like to introduce myself properly." He stood up, straightening his tie. "I'm a civil rights attorney with 15 years of experience handling discrimination cases." The change in Mrs. Reynolds' expression was instant. The color drained from her face as she finally looked, really looked, at the quiet student's father. Her hands, which had been folded neatly on the table, began to fidget with her pen. "We're here today," the father continued, opening his briefcase, "because my son has experienced systematic discrimination in your classroom, Mrs. Reynolds, and we have evidence." One by one, he laid out the documentation. Photos of unfairly graded assignments. Side-by-side comparisons of identical work with drastically different scores. The principal's eyes widened as the evidence pile grew. This could be interpreted differently, Mrs. Reynolds started, but her voice trailed off as the father pulled out his tablet. "Let's watch some footage from your classroom," he suggested, pressing play. The videos were crystal clear. The constant interruptions, the dismissive tone, the unfair treatment captured from multiple angles by concerned students. Mrs. Reynolds shifted in her seat. "Students aren't allowed to record in class," she protested weakly. "Interesting that's your concern," the father replied, "rather than your behavior in these recordings." He turned to the principal. There's more. We've spoken to families from your previous schools. The boy watched as his father presented statements from other parents and students, documenting similar patterns at 3 different schools. Each time, Mrs. Reynolds had transferred before any official action could be taken. You see, the father explained, his voice steady, discrimination doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers in dismissive comments. Sometimes it hides in unfair grading. Sometimes it masks itself as high standards that somehow only apply to certain students. The boy's mother squeezed his hand under the table as his father continued. My son spent weeks doubting himself, thinking if he just worked harder, you would treat him fairly. But the problem was never his work ethic, it was your prejudice. Mrs. Reynolds attempted to interrupt, but the father held up his hand. I'm not finished. We're not just here for my son. We're here for every student who came before him, and every student who might have had you as a teacher in the future. The principal, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke up. These accusations are very serious. They're not accusations, the father corrected, pulling out one final document. They're facts, and they're backed up by 27 witness statements, 42 recordings, and a pattern of behavior documented across 3 school districts. The boy sat up straighter, feeling a surge of pride. His father turned to Mrs. Reynolds, who now seemed much smaller than she had at the start of the meeting. You had power over these children, he said, his voice filled with controlled emotion. You used that power to hurt them, to make them feel less than they are. That ends today. The principal cleared his throat. Mrs. Reynolds, please wait outside while I discuss this with the family. As she stood to leave, her hands shaking slightly, the boy found his voice. Mrs. Reynolds, he said clearly, making her pause at the door. I want you to know that I never stopped believing in myself. My dad taught me that standing up for what's right is more important than staying quiet when things are wrong. She didn't respond, but her shoulders slumped as she left the room. The boy's father placed a proud hand on his son's shoulder, and in that moment, they both knew that things were about to change, not just for one classroom, but for an entire school system that had looked the other way for far too long. The school board meeting room buzzed with nervous energy. Rows of chairs had been set up, and every single one was filled. Parents, teachers, and students sat shoulder to shoulder, their whispers creating a soft hum that bounced off the wooden walls. The boy sat in the front row with his parents, his hands folded neatly in his lap just like his father had shown him. Behind them sat his classmates and their families, many holding folders filled with their own stories. His friend who had recorded the videos gave him a thumbs up from 2 rows back. The school board members filed in, 7 adults in business suits taking their places at the long table up front. The principal was there too, looking more nervous than the boy had ever seen him. Mrs. Reynolds sat alone at a small table to the side, her usual confident smile replaced by a tight-lipped frown. We're here today, the board chairperson announced, her voice echoing in the suddenly quiet room, to address serious allegations of discriminatory behavior in our district. The boy's father stood up, straightening his tie. He looked different today, not like the dad who made pancakes on Sundays, but like the lawyer who fought for people's rights. Members of the board, he began, what you're about to hear isn't just one incident or one misunderstanding. This is about a pattern of behavior that has followed Mrs. Reynolds through 3 different schools. One by one, former students and their parents came forward to speak. A mother described how her daughter had stopped raising her hand in class. A father talked about his son's grades dropping for no clear reason. Each story was different, but they all pointed to the same truth. The boy's friend stepped up to the podium, her tablet in hand. I started recording because I knew something wasn't right, she said, her voice shaking slightly but growing stronger. Teachers are supposed to help us grow, not make us feel small. The recordings played on the big screen at the front of the room. Everyone watched in silence as Mrs. Reynolds' behavior was displayed for all to see. The dismissive comments, the unfair grading, the constant interruptions. Some board members shook their heads, while others took detailed notes. Then it was the boy's turn to speak. His legs felt wobbly as he walked to the podium, but when he looked back, he saw his parents smiling encouragingly. His father gave him a subtle nod, and suddenly, the words came easily. "I used to love going to school," he said, his voice clear and steady. "I loved learning new things and solving problems. But in Mrs. Reynolds' class, it didn't matter how hard I worked or how many right answers I had. She made me feel like I didn't belong there." He pulled out his folder of evidence, the unfairly graded tests, the research project she had dismissed, the detailed notes he'd kept of every incident. "But I remembered what my dad always says, that when something's wrong, we have a responsibility to speak up, not just for ourselves, but for others who might be afraid to use their voice." As he spoke, more students stood up in the audience, silently showing their support. The board members exchanged glances, their expressions growing more serious with each passing moment. When Mrs. Reynolds finally got her chance to speak, her excuses sounded hollow. "I maintain high standards for all my students," she insisted, but her voice wavered as she looked at the room full of evidence that proved otherwise. The board chairperson held up a thick file. "We've reviewed records from your previous schools," she said. "Each time complaints started, you transferred. But patterns like this don't disappear just because you change locations." One board member, an older gentleman with kind eyes, leaned forward. "Teaching isn't just about maintaining standards," he said firmly. "It's about believing in every student's potential and helping them reach it. From what we've seen today, you've done the opposite." The room held its breath as the board prepared to make their decision. The boy felt his mother's hand slip into his, and he squeezed it gently. Whatever happened next, he knew things would be different. Not just for him, but for every student who would come after him. As the chairperson cleared her throat to announce their decision, the boy realized something important. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is tell your truth, even when your voice shakes. And sometimes, when you're brave enough to speak up, others find their courage too. The boardroom fell silent as the chairperson stood up, adjusting her glasses as she prepared to deliver the board's decision. The boy felt his heart beating fast, like a drum in his chest. His father's hand rested supportively on his shoulder. After reviewing all the evidence, the chairperson began, her voice firm and clear, including student testimonies, video recordings, grade comparisons, and records from previous schools. "This board has reached a unanimous decision." Mrs. Reynolds sat stiffly in her chair, her fingers gripping the edge of her table. The principal looked down at his hands, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Effective immediately, Mrs. Reynolds will be placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation by the district. The chairperson paused, looking directly at the teacher. "Your teaching license will be reviewed by the State Board of Education." A collective exhale seemed to sweep through the room. The boy's friend squeezed her mom's hand, tears of relief in her eyes. Other students exchanged quiet smiles, while parents nodded in approval. Furthermore, the chairperson continued, "We are implementing several immediate changes." She lifted a document from her desk. "First, every teacher in our district will be required to complete comprehensive cultural sensitivity training. This isn't just about one teacher or one classroom. It's about making our entire school system better." The boy watched as his father quickly jotted down notes, just like he always did during important meetings. His mother wiped a proud tear from her eye. "Second, we're establishing a new system for reporting and addressing discrimination concerns." The chairperson gestured to a group of parents in the audience. "We'll be forming a diverse committee of parents, teachers, and administrators to oversee this process. We want every student to feel safe speaking up when something isn't right." Mrs. Reynolds started to stand, perhaps to protest, but the chairperson raised her hand. "We're not finished. All current and past students from Mrs. Reynolds' classes will have their grades reviewed by an independent panel. Any unfair grades will be adjusted accordingly." The boy thought about all his classmates who had struggled silently, whose grades hadn't reflected their true abilities. He felt a warmth in his chest, knowing they would finally get justice too. Lastly, the chairperson said, her voice softening as she looked at the boy and the other students, "We want to acknowledge the courage it took to come forward. Speaking up against unfairness isn't easy, especially when the person treating you unfairly is in a position of authority." The older board member who had spoken earlier stood up. "We're also implementing a new merit-based academic support program," he announced. "Every student deserves the chance to excel, regardless of their background. This program will ensure that talent and hard work are the only factors that matter in our classrooms." As Mrs. Reynolds was escorted out of the room by district officials, she looked smaller somehow, her shoulders hunched under the weight of her actions. The boy didn't feel happy seeing her leave. Instead, he felt relieved that no other student would have to feel the way he had felt in her class. The principal approached the boy's father afterward, his face showing genuine remorse. "We should have acted sooner," he admitted. "But your son's courage has helped us see what we needed to change. Sometimes it takes a child to teach adults the most important lessons." Outside the boardroom, students and parents gathered in small groups, sharing hugs and words of encouragement. The boy's friend ran up to him, grinning. "We did it," she exclaimed. "We actually did it." His father knelt down to his eye level, straightening his son's collar like he always did during important moments. "You know what happened today?" he asked softly. "You showed everyone that one voice speaking the truth can change an entire system. I couldn't be prouder." Walking to the car, the boy noticed the afternoon sun seemed brighter somehow. Tomorrow, he would go back to school knowing things would be different, not just for him, but for every student who would walk through those doors. Sometimes, he realized, the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of courage. 3 months had passed since the school board hearing, and the hallways felt different now. There was a new energy in the air, like fresh paint that had finally dried. The boy walked through the corridor, his backpack lighter somehow, not just with fewer books, but with the weight of worry finally gone from his shoulders. His new math teacher, Mrs. Chen, had transformed the classroom into a place where every hand raised was a hand acknowledged. She had a way of making complex problems seem like exciting puzzles waiting to be solved. When students made mistakes, she called them learning moments and used them to help everyone understand better. "You know what I love about mathematics?" she often said, her eyes twinkling. "It doesn't care where you come from or what you look like. It only cares about how hard you try and how much you want to learn." The boy had started a study group that met during lunch breaks. Students who once sat alone now gathered around tables in the library, helping each other with homework and sharing snacks. His friend who had recorded the videos was there too, using her tablet now to make educational tutorials for anyone who needed extra help. One morning, the principal called him to the office. But this time, it wasn't about trouble. "We'd like you to be part of our new student advisory council," he explained. "Your voice helped us see what needed to change. Now we want you to help make sure those changes last." The boy looked at the certificate on the principal's wall. It was from the new training program his father had helped design. Every teacher in the district had completed it, learning about fairness, understanding, and the importance of believing in every student's potential. At home, his little sister proudly showed him her math homework. "My teacher says I might be ready for advanced classes next year," she beamed. "And guess what? She never makes anyone feel bad for asking questions." His father had been busy too, working with other parents to create a network that spread beyond their school. They called it the Equal Education Initiative, helping students and families across the district know their rights and speak up when things weren't right. "Remember how scared you were to tell us about Mrs. Reynolds?" his father asked one evening as they worked on a puzzle together. "Now other kids have a safe way to share their concerns before things get that bad." The boy nodded, fitting another piece into place. "Like how the new suggestion box in the hallway actually gets checked every day." "Exactly," his father smiled. and how the student council has a real voice in school decisions now. The changes weren't just in their school. Other districts had started adopting their reporting system and training programs. The boy's story had sparked a movement, like a small stone creating ripples in a pond. One day, a new student joined their class. The boy watched as Mrs. Chen introduced him to everyone, making sure he felt welcome. During lunch, he invited the new kid to join their study group. At my old school, the new student said quietly, teachers didn't always treat everyone the same. The boy shared his own story then, not with sadness anymore, but with pride in how things had changed. That doesn't happen here, he explained. And if it ever did, we know how to fix it now. After school, walking home with his friend, they passed the playground where younger kids were playing. A little girl was helping her classmate with math flashcards, both of them laughing and celebrating each correct answer. You know what's really cool? His friend said, adjusting her backpack. We didn't just fix one classroom. We helped make school better for everyone who comes after us. The boy looked back at the school building, its windows reflecting the afternoon sun. He thought about Mrs. Reynolds sometimes, hoping she had learned from what happened. But mostly, he thought about all the students who would never have to feel the way he once did. That evening, as he finished his homework at the kitchen table, his mom hung his latest math test on the fridge, a perfect score. But it wasn't the grade that made him smile. It was knowing that in classrooms across the district, every student now had a fair chance to reach their full potential, just like his father had always said they deserved. Sometimes the biggest victories aren't about defeating someone else, he realized. They're about making sure everyone has the chance to succeed. And that was a lesson worth learning.